In the quiet towns that dotted the edge of the American frontier, stories didn't always begin with love, but often with a bargain, a train ticket, and a name written in ink that would soon be tested in fire. She was 40 perhaps, a year or two past. Still untouched, though not unloved, not in the way a girl dreams to be loved. Ruth Callahan had always been too proper, too quiet, too strange, they said, and now too old. Her body had not been shaped for men's gazes, and her spirit had long grown cautious in the face of disappointment. Yet still, she hoped. When she answered the ad, she did so not to chase romance, but to escape the loneliness that crept in like the chill beneath a winter doorframe. She packed carefully: a Bible, a photograph of her mother, a blue ribbon from her childhood she'd never had reason to wear again, and a letter, a promise from a man in Dust Creek who'd said she sounded gentle, and that was what he was looking for. But when she stepped off the train, the laughter met her first. They hadn't expected her to look so modest, so unpracticed. And when they whispered still pure, like it was a joke passed around a poker table, Ruth realized something terrible. The man she'd come to marry had sold her story before she even arrived. To them, she was a novelty, a punchline, a virgin still, and an unwanted one at that. But what they didn't count on was him, a man standing apart from the crowd, half shadowed by the station's eaves. He didn't laugh, didn't point, just watched. And when Ruth turned to leave, clutching her satchel with trembling hands and tears she refused to let fall, he stepped forward. His name was Elias Boon, a rancher, a widower, a man with a silence in his soul deeper than most could bear, and a heart that still remembered what dignity looked like even when others had forgotten. What happened next wasn't a rescue. It was something rarer. He didn't pity her. He saw her. And if you stay with us, dear friend, we'll tell you how a woman who had never been wanted learned at last what it felt like to be chosen, not for what she had never given, but for who she quietly was. This is not a tale of fireworks. It's a tale of a flame lit slow. And if you've ever wondered whether it's too late for a soul like yours, maybe this story is meant for you. In the dusty stillness of a frontier town tucked between the dry hills of Wyoming, 1886, the world had already passed Ruth Tally by, or so they said. At 42, she was a woman no one looked at twice. Her hands bore the calluses of a lifetime spent laundering for men who wouldn't meet her eye. Her eyes had grown used to scanning the ground not out of shame, but habit learned from years of being told to take up less space, make less sound, and ask for even less than that. She had never married not by choice, but by circumstance. Every suitor her father once entertained had been turned off by one strange and inconvenient truth: Ruth Tally had made it to middle age without ever lying with a man. Virginity in girls of 18 was prized. In women of 40, it was seen as a flaw, something unnatural, something odd. Her purity became a mark of ridicule in a town that whispered behind hands. Why hadn't she married? What was wrong with her? Was she too pious, too stiff, too untouched? Her father had never stopped resenting it, not even as his health failed, not even as the money ran out. And so in a final act of cruelty masked as duty, he sold her. Ruth never saw the contract, only the wagon. She was told to pack light. No one asked what she wanted. She didn't cry, not then, because Ruth had learned long ago when her mother died too young and the laundry piled too high that some women are not given the right to weep aloud. Some must fold their heartbreak into linens, stack it on their heads, and carry it to the next doorstep. She was being sent across the plains to a rancher she had never met in a distant territory under the guise of being a mail-order bride. But it was no romance. The town folk knew. Her father had whispered it in the saloon when he was half drunk. Still untouched she is. Some men pay good for that. By the time she climbed into the wagon, she was already someone's property. The wheels turned. And so began the quiet erasure of a woman who had asked for nothing and still had too much taken. But what Ruth didn't know, what no one in that town had the kindness or imagination to believe, was that hundreds of miles west, a man named Silas Boon had also been forgotten by the world. And he too carried a sorrow that made him see clearly in the dark. What happens when two people, both discarded by society, meet not in love, but in silence and survival? The trail west was long and hot and unkind. Ruth sat upright in the rickety wagon, hands folded in her lap, like she was still waiting in her father's parlor for approval that would never come. Her single suitcase, brown leather, scuffed at the corners, rested by her feet. She didn't speak unless spoken to. The driver didn't speak at all. 3 days in, she stopped wondering where she was going. 5 days in, she stopped praying someone might stop this. On the seventh day they arrived. Boon Ridge wasn't a town, not really. Just a stretch of fencing, a barn missing part of its roof, and a house too big for the one man who lived in it. Silas Boon stepped out onto the porch like a shadow peeled away from wood. He wore no smile, no welcome. But neither did he leer. That alone was unfamiliar. Ruth had braced herself for a man with greed in his eyes, the sort who'd paid for her like livestock and planned to collect. But Silas only looked at her with a worn steadiness, as if he too had once been purchased by a fate he didn't ask for. "You'll find the kitchen stocked," he said quietly. "Room upstairs is yours." She waited, for the expectation, for the grip on her wrist, for the command that always followed when a woman was no longer free. But it didn't come. Silas turned and walked back into the house like he'd forgotten she was there. Ruth, unsure what to do with the breath she'd been holding, picked up her suitcase and followed. The silence in that house was heavy, but not cruel. A chair creaked. A kettle hissed. Somewhere a dog barked once in the distance, then stopped. The bedroom was clean, sparse but cared for. On the windowsill sat a single tin of dried lavender, long since faded, but still fragrant. Someone had placed it there not for beauty, but perhaps for memory. That night, Ruth did not sleep. Her eyes wandered the ceiling's beams, wondering if they'd ever collapse, wondering if the man downstairs slept any better than she did. Silas did not approach her, not even on the second or third day. He ate his meals in silence. He left her room untouched. He spoke only when needed, short, soft words, but not unkind. And that was the strange thing. He was not unkind. On the fifth morning, Ruth rose before dawn to sweep the kitchen floor, more from habit than duty, and found him already outside mending the fence with his shirt sleeves rolled and his brow wet with honest sweat. She watched through the window. He moved like a man used to being alone, a man who had stopped waiting for company, a man perhaps who didn't want a bride at all. When she asked him that evening, her voice barely above a whisper, "Why me?" he looked at her, really looked, and said, "I didn't send for anyone. Someone sent you. That's not your fault." He didn't elaborate, but Ruth sat with that for a long time. When a woman is sent as a joke, and a man never asked for company, what grows in the space between them? Suspicion, or something gentler. Ruth had lived most of her life waiting for doors to close behind her. Some locked, some not, but all of them carried the same message: you don't belong here. So when she reached for the handle of the sitting room, its frame bowed with time paint chipping like dried skin, she expected it to resist, to creak, to whisper, "This isn't yours." It didn't. It opened, quietly. Inside was a room filled with memory, not hers but someone else's. A rocking chair worn smooth by years of motion. A mended quilt folded neatly on a trunk. And above the fireplace, a faded photograph of a woman with a baby in her lap and sunlight in her eyes. Silas Boon's past sat openly on the mantel. Ruth stepped in, slowly, hesitant. She had not been told she couldn't. But she had not been told she could either. Her eyes were drawn again to the woman in the photograph. Slender, fair, beautiful, in the way that made people soften when she entered a room. The kind of woman folks didn't sell as a joke. Ruth didn't hate her, but she felt suddenly larger than she already was. 50 years old, thick-hipped, and heavy with the weight of other people's laughter. The woman in the photo didn't know shame like that. She didn't walk into a room and feel it shrink. Ruth backed out of the room and shut the door gently, leaving it as she found it, unlocked but not welcoming. That night, Silas noticed in the way men do when they aren't used to having anyone notice them back. "You've been in the front room," he said, not accusing, just stating. "I didn't touch anything," she replied too quickly. "You could have." He turned his fork in his hand. "It's a room, Ruth, not a grave." She looked down at her plate. The silence between them, once simply emptiness, now brimmed with something tender and hard to name. He added, "My wife's been gone 10 years. My son 8. The house stayed quiet after that." "Still does," Ruth nodded. "It's not wrong, the quiet. It makes you forget your own voice." Silas didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was soft. I reckon I forgot mine too. They didn't speak again that night. But when Ruth went to the front room the next morning, she found the photograph had been moved. Not hidden, just turned slightly as if to give her room. And on the armrest of the rocking chair, folded neat, was a worn book of prairie poems, with a ribbon marking a page. She didn't open it yet, but she sat beside it for a while. Sometimes healing begins in a room left unlocked, not because you're invited in, but because no one stopped you. What Ruth finds next will test everything she believes about worth and welcome. It had been 3 weeks since Ruth arrived at the Boon Ranch. 3 weeks of quiet breakfasts, slow stitching, and the gentle rhythm of chores that filled the hollows of her loneliness. Yet even in the peaceful hush of morning, something inside her still braced for cruelty, for the punchline, for someone to lean close and whisper that she didn't deserve the soft chair, or the warm bread, or the steady way Silas looked at her like she was whole. Because people didn't look at her that way. Not before. But Silas did. He didn't flatter. Didn't toss kind words like coins into a cup. He simply made space. Let her sit where she wanted, walk at her pace, take second helpings without comment. And slowly Ruth began to ease into her own skin, not because he asked her to, but because he didn't. One evening, as the sun pulled low across the plains and painted the window panes gold, Silas came in from the barn. He was dusted in hay, the cuffs of his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He looked tired in the way that working men do when they've given something honest to the day. She handed him a cup of coffee. Their fingers brushed. He didn't pull away. Instead, he said her name. Not in passing, not in instruction, not like men had said it before with impatience or distance, or that terrible amused pity. He said it like it belonged to her. Ruth, he said again, soft as the porch light behind them. You're good company, she swallowed hard. You don't have to say that. I didn't, he said, sipping. I wanted to. A long silence sat between them after that, but it didn't ache. It settled. Later that week, Ruth ventured into town to fetch fabric. She walked past the mercantile window and caught her reflection in the glass round-faced hair pinned back sturdy in her traveling dress. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't flinch. Inside, the clerk, young sharp-eyed, eyed her up and down before asking, "You're the one they sent to Mr. Boon, huh?" Ruth stiffened. "Yes." "Huh," the girl said, smirking. "Didn't think he'd keep you." Ruth held her gaze. "He didn't keep me. I stayed." It was a small sentence, but it was the first one she said in years that felt like a flag planted in the dirt. She bought her fabric and walked out slow. That night when she returned, Silas had left something on her bedside table. A small wooden comb carved with care, and on the back in neat scratched letters, "You belong." When someone says your name like it matters, something long buried begins to stir. But with every step toward being seen, Ruth must confront the fear of what it means to be truly known. There was a room in the Boon Ranch house Ruth had never stepped into. It sat at the end of the hall with its door always slightly ajar, the scent of pine and cedarwood drifting through the gap. She passed it daily on her way to mend linens or fetch kindling, but never once touched the handle. Not out of respect, but fear. That room had once belonged to Clara Boon, the late wife, the woman whose shadow still lingered in the creaks of the floorboards and the well-worn chair by the fireplace. Ruth had never met her, but she imagined Clara had been slender and soft-voiced, perhaps, with a lovely laugh. She imagined that Silas had loved her deeply, and probably still did. And what did that make Ruth a placeholder? A pity some nights she could barely sleep, turning over every glance, every silence. She'd hear Silas breathing on the porch outside, or sharpening his knives in the barn, and wonder if he were to say Clara's name aloud, would it sound softer than when he said hers. One evening after supper, Ruth found him polishing Clara's old saddle. "You still think of her?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Silas looked up. He didn't flinch. He simply nodded. "I do." Ruth swallowed hard. "And where does that leave me?" He wiped the leather slowly. "In the present. But I'm not her." "I know. That's why I sit beside you every night." She turned to go, heart-aching with a question she couldn't yet ask. But before she reached the doorway, he added quietly, "You don't need to fit her shape, Ruth. You've got your own." The next morning, Ruth paused outside the door again. The light was spilling through its crack like a quiet invitation. Her hand trembled, but she reached for the knob and opened it. Inside was not a shrine, but a room gently frozen in time, a shawl over the bed, a book open on the windowsill, the scent of lavender. Not haunting, not sacred, just real. On the dresser sat a small portrait of Clara Boon. She wasn't young, or slight, or even beautiful by the world's cruel standards. But her eyes were kind, and suddenly Ruth didn't feel like an intruder. She stood in that room for a long while, breathing in something deeper than grief acceptance. A quiet knowing that memory did not erase the present. That she, Ruth, was not a replacement, but a continuation of kindness in this house. That night she found Silas outside fixing the porch rail. Without a word, she brought him a mug of cider. And instead of returning to her room, she sat beside him. No words passed between them for some time, but her presence said enough. I'm still here. I opened the door. I didn't run. The past may haunt, but Ruth is beginning to believe she has a right to the future. Still, love does not bloom without storms, and a letter is about to arrive that will test them both. The first storm of winter rolled in with a sound like thunder, dragging chains across the sky. It was the sort of storm that made the walls creak, made the cattle restless, and made every soul remember what it was like to feel small. Silas and Ruth had just begun to find a rhythm, a gentle, awkward, wordless rhythm. The kind built on coffee shared in silence, fences mended side by side, and a closeness that didn't need to be named. But storms, Ruth had learned, often bring more than wind and rain. They bring reckonings. The letter arrived just as the sky turned the color of coal. It was tucked into the side pocket of the supply wagon, and it bore the seal of a family Ruth hadn't spoken of in years. Her uncle, the man who had once bargained her future for a dowry, who had let her be sold off like livestock because her virginity was still worth something, who had never written to ask if she survived. Now he wanted forgiveness. Ruth read the letter under the flickering lamp, her fingers trembling. He claimed he was dying, claimed he needed to make amends, claimed she owed it to God to let him speak. I never told you about my uncle, she said later that night, standing in the barn as Silas brushed down one of the horses. Silas didn't look up. You don't owe me confessions. No, she said, her voice steady now, but I owe myself freedom. And so she told him. Everything. How she had been promised as a bride before she even finished growing. How they made her sign her name on marriage papers as if it meant nothing. How the man they sold her to had lifted her veil with a laugh and said, she's fatter than I thought. How the annulment was swift, the shame slower. Silas said nothing for a long time. He just stood there, breathing in that heavy barn air. Then he reached for her hand. You were never the one who needed forgiving, he said softly. Not then. Not now. A sob cracked through her chest. Not because of pain, but because someone had finally said the words she didn't know she'd waited her whole life to hear. She let herself cry. Really cry. There in the hay with a man who didn't flinch or shush her or look away. She cried not just for what had happened, but for all the years she had swallowed her voice just to stay acceptable. That night the storm howled, but inside the cabin it was quiet. Silas lit the fire. Ruth sat beside him, her sewing untouched. They didn't speak. They just sat, two souls finally allowed to rest. At one point he turned to her and said, I never saw you as broken. She smiled through swollen eyes. I did? For a long time. Silas looked down, thumb tracing the rim of his cup. Then let me keep showing you what I see. And in that moment she believed he would. A healing heart is still a fragile thing. But when truth is spoken and kindness offered without condition, even the most wounded can begin to hope. And hope once born is hard to silence. Spring came late to the highlands that year. The snow lingered, like an old grief refusing to melt, but beneath it the earth stirred. It always did. So did Ruth. She no longer stood with her shoulders drawn tight as a corset. Her steps were steadier now, even as her body remained heavy. That weight no longer felt like shame. It felt like substance, like something planted and rooted. The town, once so quick to mock her, now nodded when she passed. No fanfare, no apologies, just quiet nods from men who had once laughed behind their hands and from women who now came to ask if she might mend a dress or help with herbs. She did softly, without triumph, but inside she knew she was no longer the joke. Silas had made space for her in his home, and over time she had made space for herself. It wasn't a grand proposal that followed, no kneeling, no ring. Just one morning Ruth woke to find a new apron folded at the foot of her bed, stitched with her initials, RT. She blinked. T. She stepped into the kitchen where Silas was pouring coffee. You planning on changing my name? She asked, voice wry. He didn't look up. You planning on keeping it? She set the apron down gently, then walked over and wrapped her arms around his middle. I think I already have. The wedding was held in their own pasture just under the apple tree that had bloomed for the first time in 5 years. Silas built a bench himself. No preacher. Just 2 neighbors and the sheriff who knew how to keep a vow. She wore blue, not white. She said white never felt right on a woman who had already lived through storms. He wore his everyday coat. No fuss. And when he said I do, he didn't look at her like she was lucky to be chosen. He looked at her like he was. That night as they sat on the porch, the moon hanging low over the ridgeline, Ruth rested her head on his shoulder and whispered, Do you think they ever meant it? The ones who said I was too much, Silas kissed the crown of her head. They never knew what enough looked like. In the hush that followed, fireflies flickered, and the old pain like winter finally loosened its grip. Ruth closed her eyes. She wasn't the woman they mocked anymore. She was his wife. She was home. Some loves don't arrive with fireworks. They arrive with patience, respect, and a quiet knowing. If you've ever felt too much or not enough, perhaps this story was for you. And maybe it's not too late to start yours. Sometimes love doesn't arrive when we're young and glowing. It comes after the world has weathered us, after we've heard the laughter behind our backs, after we've been told more than once that we're too much or not enough. But in the stillness of Dust Creek, in a home built not from grand gestures, but from shared silences, Ruth found something she never thought she'd have, a place to be chosen, just as she was. Not for the shape of her body nor the years on her face, but for the quiet strength she carried through every season of heartache. Elias didn't need a perfect woman. He needed Ruth. And perhaps, dear friend, you too are carrying something the world once tried to make small. But here's the truth. You are never too late, too heavy, too quiet, or too old to be deeply seen. If this story touched a soft place in your heart, we invite you to stay a little longer with us here on None. Wild West Saga. Subscribe, share this with someone who might need its gentleness today, and tell us in the comments, would you like to see more stories like Ruth's, or hear what happened next? Because sometimes the best love stories are the ones that begin when we finally stop trying to fit into someone else's mold and let ourselves be fully known.